I was listening to Leo Strauss's, he gave a speech in 1954 called What is Political Philosophy? And a lot of that speech was dedicated to him sort of differentiating the line between political science and political philosophy and what to do with the sort of cult of rationalism that we find ourselves in. But one line that I pulled from that that I think might be a good segue into my next question is Strauss stated, all political actions aim at either preservation or change. And now some people, I mean, when I first read that, the first thing that I or heard that, the first thing that I thought about was like, oh yeah, well, this is classic left-right distinction. If you're a Jordan Peterson fan, maybe he would call it order and chaos. There needs to be a balance. And so there's always this tension then between preserving the things that we have and changing out of necessity in order to continue on to the prosperous future. And the area where I think Strauss really brings this idea home for me is this concept of esoteric writing, which of course also implies esoteric reading as well. We've mentioned it already, but we haven't actually dealt with it explicitly here. So you want to just state for the listeners what Strauss's discovery or rediscovery of esoteric writing means and what it might mean for us as readers of old texts.
Yeah. First, let me say, because I think it connects nicely to that passage on preservation and change. So first of all, What is Political Philosophy is an amazing essay. It's in the book called What is Political Philosophy. There's a shorter version that was published in an academic journal. I recommend the longer version. It has some additional features. It's the one that's in the book. So what he actually says, that whole argument about preservation and change is really one of the most beautiful, I think, passages in Strauss. So he says, all political action aims at either preservation or change, as you said. And we seek to preserve the good and stop it from getting worse, or to change things from worse to better. We want to either improve things or stop them from getting worse. So what that means is that to want something to get better or to want it not to get worse implies some standard of the good with reference to which it would be better or worse, right? Closer to that standard, better; further away from it, worse. So he says, if all political action aims at preservation or change, and all preservation or change aims at the better and not the worse, therefore has an implicit reference to the good, our notion of the good has, as a rule, the status of opinion. We have the opinion that X is good or whatever, right? That equality is good or sovereignty is good or whatever it happens to be. Our implicit standard of the good has the status of opinion. And what Strauss says is that it's in principle possible that we would want to transform our opinion about the good into knowledge of the good. And that is what he calls, at this stage in that essay, the task of political philosophy. Political philosophy would mean uncovering the implicit opinion about the good that guides our judgment of political action and trying to transform it into knowledge, really thinking about what is good. Now, one of the things that happens when you do that, when you uncover the guiding opinion about the good and subject it to further inquiry, is that you transgress the whole realm that's delineated by that opinion. So what Strauss says, following Plato and other classical thinkers here, is that opinion is the element of society. Political societies are held together by an opinion about the good, an opinion about the good that's instituted in their law. So law somehow formalizes the opinion about the good understood comprehensively, but it still has the status of opinion. So when you call it into question, when you philosophize, when you try to transform opinion into knowledge, you subject the whole realm of the legal and of the moral, of the customary and of the social into, you put it into doubt, right? You wonder, maybe not, right? Maybe our claim to fame is not the final word here on what's good. Authors who do that, they risk facing the wrath of the community, of the political community. So for example, in the medieval medieval communities of divine law in Islam and Judaism, you couldn't just openly say, well, revelation, was the world created? No, I think the world's eternal. There's no creator, there's no revelation. Moses was a fraud, or something like that, right? Now, not that the philosopher would say Moses is a fraud, but you'd say, is what we call revelation really revelation, or is it an act of legislation rationally that has recourse to the gods in order to make it believable for the people? So all of this is to say that when you call opinion into question, you call the foundation of society into question. And that comes with risks, both to the philosopher and to the non-philosopher. And for this reason, Strauss said, among other reasons, philosophers historically, some of them, have tended to, in their writing, which is public, I can't control who reads what I write. If it's just, okay, this is going to be broadcast to people, so there's going to be an open audience. But if it was just you and I talking, right, a private conversation, that's one thing. But when the communication is going to be public, you have to have some concern for how it's received publicly. Again, protect yourself, protect everybody else, and protect philosophy and the law, both of which have their place. So for this reason, philosophers sometimes conveyed their genuine thoughts in a way that wouldn't be publicly comprehensible, but would be comprehensible by the careful readers who could put two and two together or do even more complex operations than that, and who can get through ways that Strauss wrote about in Persecution and the Art of Writing, the genuine teaching or the true teaching. So one thing on the surface, one thing beneath the surface. And that idea that philosophers write, that some philosophers with a political concern write esoterically. My son brought me a cup of coffee. Yeah. That some philosophers with a political concern write esoterically, it helps us understand the limitations of the city as a community that's structured by opinion. So there's no popular enlightenment. There's no general enlightenment. There's no removing all public prejudice and just injecting it with scientific bleach or with insight and illumination. According to the classics, that's not possible. You can't, that's a fool's errand. You can't have popular enlightenment. So it teaches us something about the limits of the city. But one of the things that I always found was amazing about Strauss's idea of esoteric writing, when I first heard somebody say this about it, is that it gives us access to the whole tradition of political philosophy. Books that we would think we understood, we can now reread with an eye to what the authors genuinely meant to say. Their surface teaching can give us the impression that they're children of their time. It's like I said in that pro seminar, they may pay lip service to the prevailing beliefs of their time on the surface of their text. But if you know how to read them and how to read them carefully, you may see that they have a shared interest from era to era, from epoch to epoch. That if beneath the surface of their public pieties, there's a constant philosophical interest, then what Strauss says is this shows us the eternal character of our fundamental concerns. They appear to change from time to time as a function of the style of writing. The need to present, the need to pay lip service to the prevailing prejudices gives the impression that thinkers are a product of their time. But if you can see past that, you see that they're all addressing the constant nature of man. And suddenly you have a different configuration, of problems. You're no longer thinking as a progressivist or as a historicist or as a relativist, because they point to our constant fundamental concerns, if Strauss is right.
Yes. So if Strauss is right, you're granting these philosophers more credit than might be apparent, right? That they're not blindly, as you said, products of their time, but that they're consciously aware of both their time and the time that came before, and the fact that there will be people who are reading them after themselves.
Yes, definitely. A point that Strauss makes for sure explicitly sometimes, that if a philosopher is writing for future generations, for potential philosophers who come in the future, okay, now Nietzsche does it explicitly, but other thinkers did it implicitly, that can guide how we read their texts, how we understand them, and what they mean for us. Yeah. Whenever we think that a philosopher is the product of his time, somehow we don't see that the philosopher is, in his own way, yeah, sort of like a master of time. Philosophers can beget eras. They can beget epochs. They can shape time. They have something about the magician, the tarot symbolism of the magician in them in that way. And we also think of time in a unclear way when we think that philosophers are products of their time. Like, we don't have a phenomenology of time when we say
Mm.
that. We
Or an
have an
adequate one.
inherited opinion that we haven't thought through.
Mm.
And when we do turn towards a sort of phenomenology of time and get clear about that, then the picture looks different. And then we can revisit those writings newly.
Yes. And would you say then, obviously, none of these concerns, as Strauss would point out, are antiquated either to Strauss's time and to now. We started off this conversation by drawing parallels to the current political climate and environment. Um, and so, would you say, in light of that, that there is a certain negligence of subtlety to this claim of being too confined by the strictures of one's day, and that in fact you would want to encourage today's philosophers, whomever they might be, whoever they might be, to take care and to learn the proper lesson from Strauss, which is that you do have a city to contend with, and so you shouldn't sacrifice yourself or the philosopher to the city in the pursuit of your philosophy. Instead, you should take more care and have the appropriate amount of subtlety if what you're doing is pushing for, as he would say, a kind of change.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a good phrase, to negligence of subtlety. And I think that it runs throughout various facets of this problem. There's a negligence of subtlety in reading, in writing, in thinking, in conduct, in assessment, in judgment. And Strauss says, he tries at least to show us what it means not to be negligent of subtlety in reading. For example, in his commentaries on Xenophon, if anybody has the good fortune to look at On Tyranny, for example, you have a dialogue by Xenophon called the Hiero, where it's a poet speaking to a tyrant, and then Strauss's commentary. And anybody, I wager to say, who reads the dialogue and then reads the commentary will be blown away by what they didn't see until Strauss showed them. What it means to be subtle, careful, slow, and attentive. Strauss shows us that. That's in reading. But you can't really learn how to read without simultaneously learning how these authors wrote. So you learn the subtlety of writing. Well, the writing is also an expression to a certain extent, maybe not in a one-to-one correspondence, but enough to make the point of thinking. So you learn the subtlety of thinking and of expression, of the concerns, and all of these things. So um, subtlety is a big virtue, let's say, that according to Strauss we're missing. We have this sort of like this sort of high-minded, unjustified brutalism in our reading, in our writing, and in our thinking. And when we do have subtleties, there's of the sort of trivial hair-splitting kind, and not of the kind that gets you to the mysterium tremendum or whatever.